Hello, my name is Tom Wilson, and welcome to session 3 of our series, How to Create the Life You Want. As you know, this is based on my book, Next Stage, and I look forward to sharing some of my insights and some of the things I learned in my development of this book, because we're going to deal with an important question. It's the second in our series of 5 questions, and that is, are you going to have enough money? You know, I find for some people, this is perhaps the most troubling question. It's the things that they are the most concerned about, and clearly something that they either need to work on or need to realize that they're not as bad off as they may think. And for others, it's really not an issue at all, in that they have plenty of wealth, plenty of money, and they have a different kind of questions about when they think about money. Well, so today's session is we're going to just look at a variety of different ways of understanding the financial conditions and begin to give you some tools or some things to work with that you can begin to analyze your own situation. I often say it's very important to have a strong financial planner, and you'll hear me talk about it. I'm not a financial planner, but I am working with one, and I have great admiration for them. But be careful, because there are a lot of people out there who are looking for opportunities to separate you from your money. And there are a lot of people who are really charlatans out there, or people who are really not interested in your particular self-interest. So choose carefully and choose wisely. And I'll talk some about that in a few minutes. But it's important to really understand your financial conditions, because the key thing here is to give you a sense of financial security. Wouldn't it be wonderful to just not have to think about money at all? You know, enough is going to be there. It doesn't mean you can be extravagant. You can do things that are irresponsible, but you clearly have something that you're ready. And part of the reason why it's very important at this stage to pay attention to that is because it may become a time that you're fine now, but in 20 years from now or 30 years from now, when you're in a consolidation stage, or perhaps even in your more final stage, that is not the time you want to have a financial crisis, because you'll be a lot less flexible. So it's a warning, but it's also an important motivation for us to take care of the issues today. And planning ahead makes an enormous difference. So let's begin our session. Financials, in other words, is dealing with this important question: will you have enough money? As remember, this is one of the 5 questions. So if this is the first session that you're really looking at in this series, you decided to skip the other 2. This is an important one, but it's within a context of understanding what you would do with your time, who you're going to live with, your health, and other issues of identity. I'm highlighting today some of the most interesting research that I found, and they're kind of, I'll call it helpful hints. You may actually know a lot of this, and some of this is old hat to you. Some of it may be, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And so it gives you some areas to explore and to develop, and you begin to think about it more carefully, about how do you create the financial security that you want in this stage of your life. So while you are defining your personal mission and purpose, as we talked about in the last session, for this next stage of your life, you will have the challenge to live responsibly, to live on what you have generated at this point in your life, and what you may need to do to continue to generate if the current resources are not available. This means that you need to define the security you want within the financial resources that you have. This is that time in life when you're shifting, your income is shifting from what you earn to what you have invested. So this is very important to understand what that looks like. It's also important to work with yourself, your significant other, professionals, to understand the facts of the current situation, and to look at those financial conditions and see what they mean, because it's a blending. You hear me talk about this a lot, a blending between facts and feelings. There are lots of resources and books and podcasts and programs on managing your money during these retirement years. So today I'm just going to summarize some of the fundamentals, some of the guidance for financial planning, some of the things that I found quite interesting and important tidbits to know. This should prepare you to work with a financial planner more efficiently and more effectively. And there are many things to learn about this subject here in this subject, and I encourage you to do your research and reading and examination. I imagine that you're getting a lot of information, inquiries from people who want to tell you how you should invest your money, the programs to use with your money, ways to make your money last longer. As I said earlier, I'm not a financial planner, but I encourage you to find someone you can trust who both understands what you need and can be an important resource to you. There are a lot of people looking to separate you from your money, as I said, so be careful. In my book, I do talk about different types of financial planners, so it's good to understand who they are and essentially how they are motivated and how they're compensated, because that makes a big difference in terms of the relationship that you're likely to have with them. We're not going to cover those in our session today, but the important message here is to choose wisely. So financial planning is basically a task where you identify the facts and you also identify your feelings and you bring them together to understand where you have your foundation and your foundation security. We're looking for a peace of mind, a strong sense of financial security, and determine whether you can pursue the activities that you want and know that you will be financially independent. The reason is quite simple. I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. If you use your financial resources at a rate that is not sustainable, then there will likely come a time when you will be in a financial crisis just at the time when you have less flexibility and less capability to address them. That is why planning now, with possibly small adjustments now, will have a substantial benefit to you in the future. I know it's often hard to experience short-term pain for long-term gain, especially when the future is so uncertain. But it's important to know that what simple actions you can do today can have some fantastic consequences, positive consequences for you in the future. And you can be rest assured that everything will be okay. This is the purpose of doing financial planning and the actions that you now take that will benefit you for the rest of your life. So for today, in my research, I found a number of important facts. As I said, you may already know these, and if so, that's good. Some things may be new, and some are just important reminders for you. They should be helpful for you in working with financial planner because you are ultimately responsible for your financial conditions. It is not their job. Their job is to help you, but you have ultimately the responsibility. So here are some things that are important to know. First of all, Social Security, if you can delay it till age 70, you are likely to see a substantial increase in the amount of money that you would receive from your Social Security accounts. You could gain as much as 30% more dollars in Social Security if you wait between age 62 and 70, just before you start your distribution. If you wait, the benefit you will receive will increase your income by 6 to 8% per year. So if you can push it off, that might be a good way to increase your income later on. And if not, I know it's kind of depends about how long you think you're going to live and do you have enough confidence in the Social Security system. But realistically, if you can put it off, it will actually have a great benefit to you. So there's a thing that is called required minimum distribution, or RMDs, that if you remember, when you put money into your 401k, your IRA, your 403b, your SEP, or whatever retirement plans, as you were going through your income, you were not paying tax on the money that was going in. So when you pull the money out, we'll hear about this in a minute, we pull the money out, it's taxed at ordinary income tax rates. So the issue here is that the government allow you to delay it to a certain point in time. So legislation is, and although it has recently changed, when you reach age 72, or that is you were born after 1949, you will be required by the IRS to start withdrawing from your pre-retirement accounts a certain amount. Now that amount depends somewhat on your age, conditions, and others, and it would depend on the amount of money that you have. But there are calculators for Fidelity and other places that you can that will determine what that amount is. And remember that that income that you receive will be taxed as ordinary income, just like your salary was, except there will not be withholdings. It'd just be taxed as ordinary income. Now, if you keep your assets, let's say you have a sizable chunk of income that you saved up over time. If you keep those assets invested in, say, 65% in equities and 35 or maybe 40% in fixed income, like treasury bills or bonds or CDs or whatever, you will be able to withdraw 4% of these assets every year over your expected life without running out, over expected lifetime without running out. This is called the 4% rule, and it's been around for a long time. It's been tested, and although there are some current issues around the level of income that one receives from fixed income, but and the market has obviously been kind of crazy, but that always happens. And so this was data was based back into the research from the 1920s, the 1950s, and there have been a number of people, and you can once again research this by a lot of, and there's a number of sources I note in my book that will give you a sense of that. So one way to think about it is that whatever those dollars are, if they're invested in that way I just talked about, then look at and take 4%, and that's what you can expect to receive as income from your invested assets. Now, if you are early in your retirement and you're really not sure how much money you need to have in your assets, one way to think about this is a clever way of doing this, is to figure out how much money you need. I'll talk about this in a minute in terms of the expenses. But if you take the amount of money that you'll need, and you think about, well, some of it will be covered by Social Security or some other pensions or some other sources of reliable income for you. And then whatever the difference is between those numbers and what you need to be spending to create the lifestyle that you want, if you take that number and divide it by 0.04 or divide by 4%, that will give you a number. And that number says that that's the number of assets, that's the amount of invested assets that you need to have available for you so you can pull out 4%. As long as it's invested, as talked about before, that's what you need in the way of invested assets in order to be able to provide the lifestyle that you're looking for. So the 4% rule is helpful for both planning what you and withdrawing, but also you flip it around, you can look at for determining how much money you're going to need in your assets before you can comfortably retire on the income. So let's keep going. There's some more factors here. Hope you're finding this interesting. So it's important to understand your expenses, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but that you understand your expenses and how much flexibility you have to address changes in your income. In other words, the stock market may be down, so that 4% may chew up a little bit more than it needs, but hopefully not. And so you want to think about, if you will, have some flexibility. And I'll talk more about expenses in a few minutes. But you also want to anticipate what inflation is likely to be. Now, currently, inflation is pretty low and has been for a number of years. But this is more of an anomaly in a really economic historical sense. Historically, inflation has run about 2.5%. So if you plan on your expenses, particularly those that are not fixed, like a mortgage or something like that, and you increase that by 2.5% per year, begin to stand in place what you think you're going to need in the way of what you're going to need to provide for income to cover your expenses. So another way, if you keep looking at expenses, one thing about expenses is that they will change over time. So remember our stages we talked about in the orientation session? So today we're in the reinventing adulthood stage, and you'll create what your expenses are going to be, and that's what you're going to be living on. There'll be a point in time when you'll be entering a consolidation stage. As I said earlier, you just won't be able to get around as much, and obviously there'll be a lot less things you need to spend money on. And so trips or clothing or other kinds of things, you just won't be doing those kinds of things anymore. You won't necessarily by buying new furniture for your home or any other thing. Your life will come a lot simpler and a lot calmer. And so you could probably anticipate your expenses dropping at probably age 85 or something like that. That's depending on your health, by 20%. And then it may drop again when you're in I'll call your final stage, because most of your expenses then will be tied up in basic necessities and health and expenses related to your health. So we'll talk some about that, but that one is important. The healthcare costs are an important one to cover, and maybe more beyond the scope of our work today. But it's important to understand that your expenses, in fact, will drop as opposed to continuing to rise at a 2.5% for inflation. So in your financial planning, our last point here, in your financial planning, you need to remember that as you pull money down, you will have to you'll need to pay taxes on that income. And so therefore, before you look at what income is going to be covering your expenses, you have to look at it as after-tax income. Now, that may sound rather obvious, but I do know people, and people I've talked to in my interviews, had a rude awakening when they realized that they were going to be probably spending, probably had another 25% of the income that they were going to be receiving was going to go to pay taxes. Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 18%, depending on your state taxes as well as federal taxes. But what will happen is that remember that will reduce the income, and you need to identify and realize that you're working with after-tax dollars when you think about your income. So it's a good way to lead us into talking about ways of understanding your expenses. So here's something that you can prepare when you do your work with your financial planner. Now you need to do some analytical work, some homework to understand where your money comes from, your income, and where your money goes or your expenses. So let's talk about that. Your income can come from several sources. You may continue to work, and that's fine. And you can look at what that is. You may work till you're whatever, till they, as they say, take the boots off. In that earned income is something you can anticipate. Your Social Security is most likely to in place. Private pension plans are important, or if you had bought an annuity, that'll have a guaranteed income associated to it. Obviously, different plans are different ways, whether it's spousal coverage or not, and you can work with your financial planner to talk about that. But also, it's important to also understand, one of the people I talked to in my interviews, the company he had getting a pension from went bankrupt. And while he was able to get some of it, it was about 30% of what he had anticipated, expecting in pension plan. Now, he had some other sources, so he was going to be okay, but not all pension plans are totally reliable. So you need to investigate and think about that as you plan your sources of income. The investment income I've talked about, that's that 4% rule, things of that nature. And then you may be selling certain assets or have an inheritance. And so you have to look at what the sources of income are. In looking at expenses, I found it was really helpful to think of your expenses in 4 categories. One is fixed expenses. These expenses that you have to pay every month or every quarter. They are things that you can't walk away from, that the consequences for not doing it would be rather severe. So things like a mortgage or debt, insurance, or taxes, the other things that you need to have to pay every month or every quarter or every year. That's a fixed expense. It may not change every, at periods, but it's something that's critical. There's some things that are semi-fixed expenses. That is groceries or auto expenses or clothing, things of that nature. Those are expenses that if you needed to, you could shrink them, but you can't do without them. You have to have some groceries, and there's an interesting question about, do you see, for example, dinners out or entertainment as semi-fixed or variable? Because variable expenses are things that you can choose not to do. So there could be purchases for your home, vacation, or other things. And so those are more discretionary expenses. So you think about what those get is. And then there may be some special events in your life. For example, weddings, a new car. You may want to put money aside for children or your grandchildren. So when you look at your expenses, break them into each of those four categories and look at them in some ways to say, how are those likely to change now if I progress over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? What you're doing now is look at your income, look at your expenses, and put the numbers together. Now, a lot of financial planners, and I really agree with this, is that do your projections as if you were going to live to 100. The people living to 100, that number is growing by over 1,000%, which means that there are a lot of people turning 100. You may be one of them. And you don't want to be running out of your income just at the time when your expenses when you need this to cover those expenses at that time. So it's important to plan out and project out, and that will give you a sense of financial security. It means knowing what is important to you and then living within your means so that your money does not become a crisis just at the time when you will not be able to respond. This then leads us, when you do this analysis, is to ask yourself, where am I, therefore, on a continuum? Doing that analysis, where am I as I look at my income and my expenses, am I facing a significant deficit, such as my expenses exceed my income by 20% or more? Or is it a moderate deficit? Maybe it's a 10% difference, something that can be changed now, but is not sustainable for the long term. Am I in relative balance? My income and my expenses and my projections over time are likely to be pretty much in balance. I'm going to be okay. Is there a moderate surplus? Now, when you look at it, there's actually, your income is going to exceed your expenses by 10% or more, or maybe substantial surplus. Maybe it's 20% or more. Those looking at the issues of substantial surplus, your issues is looking at legacy and looking at what you do in terms of planning for the future generations. For those in the middle, it's really one of being comfortable and feeling good about where you are. But now it also is important to think about, how do I monitor and make adjustments so that if something happens, I know I can adjust. And so that's where we have to look at the expenses and the categories of the expenses. And so, that the issues of moderate surplus, moderate deficit, think about it in terms of contingencies. When John and Mary, two of the people I interviewed, did this analysis, they realized that they were likely in a moderate deficit. So what they decided, that if they could push off leaving his job until about age 68, 69, or even 70, and then by continuing to invest in his 401k plan with his company at the same rate, and they could also keep their savings, and they could keep increasing their savings, and they realized that they changed the mix with Social Security wait till that point in time, and they kept investing those dollars, that they would be in balance by the time they reached around age 70. This was an easily attainable goal, and they were able to really make needed adjustments now. Adjustment is relatively simple. It's just rather simple. It's simple, but it's true. So this concludes our third session. Here's an outline, as we've said, of what we're focusing on as we work our way through this series. This last one, we talked about money. When we talked about an overview, where we are in the context, we talk about a sense of purpose, how we're going to spend our time. Now we're talking about money. In the next session, we're going to talk about relationships. And although it's saying, who do you want to live with? This is not just about one person. It's about your community. Many relationships will change as you think about this time of life. And as you look at this time, maybe some of them are going to need to change. So the next session, when we do this, we'll be looking at relationships. So I hope you found this session helpful give you some tidbits, little bits of information, and perhaps more importantly, to give you some direction of ways to analyze your financial conditions, because it's all about creating that sense of financial security. And I hope you are get some interesting insights from this. There's a lot more material in my book, and there are lots of resources available to you. So I encourage you to become really smart about this, because your financial situation is something that you own that's really responsible. And at any time in life, now is when it's really important to be on top of that and to understand it fully. So I hope you enjoyed this session, and I look forward to talking with you next, because I said the next session is about relationships and how we are going to, what we need to do more of and less of related to that. So I will close off today's session. I wish you a very bountiful day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.